How have we gone from where we were, let's say, 50 years ago, where marketing was all assumptions, emotions, to where we're at now, where it's still very much art, but it's also very science?
It suddenly started to become that the digital experience was actually becoming synonymous with the customer experience. If their website is down, their business is down.
The biggest challenges that I hear from marketeers is just the ability to transition fast enough and keeping up with these changes.
As well as being CEO of Optimizely, you're also running a chocolate business.
I co-founded a business around creating drinking chocolates that are out of the can, ready to drink, and it's really delicious, indulgent, and rich.
Firstly, my stomach is grumbling a little bit from hearing that description.
We have to be inspired by other areas of what we do. We have to be Renaissance people in some ways.
We did an event on creativity, and for that event, we brought in a professor of creativity. And he was talking about what's the mechanisms that trigger creative thinking. And one of the key things he spoke about was your input determines your output. So the greater variety of input that you have in your thoughts, the more you're able to connect seemingly disconnected things to spark new ideas. What I've been reading about Optimizely and what you're really promoting at the moment, which is this really interesting approach of experimentation.
We all deal with uncertainty, and the antidote to uncertainty is testing.
There's so much talk in the market about the digital transformation, and it almost seems like for a long time that it was sort of this big bang where everything is going to transform magically, but it is really digital incrementalism. It is taking those incremental steps which eventually will lead to the transformation.
Alex, Jesper, great to finally sit down with you. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while now. Jesper, you and I meet regularly. The kind of conversation that we have, I often feel like it would be great if a lot of people could hear these. Given how important marketing technology is and how your career, and of course yours, Alex, has been so centered around that, I'm really looking forward to sharing some of these ideas with CET listeners, as well as hearing it from myself. So just to get us warmed up, Alex, if you could introduce yourself and what it is that you're doing as the CEO of Optimizely.
Yes, I'm Alex Atzberger. First of all, it's great to be here with you. Thank you for giving us the opportunity. I'm CEO at Optimizely. Been CEO there now for over 2 years. Spent 15 years prior to that with SAP. I came for the first time actually to Dubai in 2000. So I have seen an enormous transformation in the region.
Very different back then, right?
Very, very different back then. And just very excited to be here because we are announcing our launch of Optimizely in the Middle East region and in the UAE. And so it's a milestone event for us, and I'm just glad to be here.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
And a real pleasure to finally sit down and meet you. You flew in from New York just a day ago, so
yes.
How are you doing on jet lag?
I'm doing fine. It's been so long that I could actually travel. I'm just excited to be somewhere else than New York. So yeah. It's good to be here, and it's totally fine. Plus, I have to admit, Emirates is probably the best airline in the world, and the service is just outstanding. So you're actually happy to be on the plane.
That's true. That's very true. Great to be on with you. And Jesper, if you'd like to, obviously I'm familiar with you, but for anyone listening, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, so my name is Jesper Broberg. I'm joining Optimizely as of yesterday as the Regional Vice President for Middle East. And I've been in the marketing technology industry for the last 12, 13 years. And really excited to join Alex and Optimizely on this journey in this region.
Brilliant. So one of the main things I want to talk about today is how marketing technology is becoming, and this is to quote you here, Alex, a science. It's moving away from assumptions and it's moving towards a science. But before we get into that, I want to go a little bit off topic, something that I'm personally very interested in.
Okay.
When I was reading your bio, it said that as well as being CEO of Optimizely, you're also running a chocolate business.
That's right. That's right.
Really interested to know more about this. So fill us in.
Yeah. Sometimes you connect different passions with each other. And one of my passions has always been around, I guess I have a sweet tooth, but it's been always around chocolates. And I thought there's a place where you can actually do something completely new, which is about the notion of drinking chocolates and how hot chocolates are actually perceived. Because I think, we all enjoy coffees. There's so many types and varieties of teas. There's so many varieties of chocolates, bean to bar. And people are willing to pay a lot of money for good chocolate. But what's really missing is kind of a good hot chocolate that's ready to drink. And so I co-founded a business around creating drinking chocolates that are out of a can, ready to drink, and it's not like a watery, poor product experience. It's really delicious, indulgent, and rich. And you know, I don't know if it's going to be a hot seller here in Dubai, given the temperatures, but in the colder regions of the world, you know, a good hot chocolate is just something that everybody should have access to. And so that's what we created, a chocolate that's based on melted chocolate rather than chocolate powder. And in many ways, I've learned through that experience around using digital technologies to kind of market the product, get connected with customers. And that firsthand experience informs me every day about my job at OptimizeD as well.
That's really interesting. So firstly, my stomach is grumbling a little bit from hearing that description. It makes a lot of sense. So it comes in a can and then you heat it yourself, right?
Yes, you can drink it actually. We call it cold hot chocolate. You can actually drink it cold, yeah, or you can heat it up. And so there's really the use case of the out of home when you're just on the go, and you just want a chocolate fix. A lot of people use it as a replacement for drinking a chocolate bar. In one can, which is 8 ounces, we nearly have 1 chocolate bar in 1 can.
Oh, nice.
So it's a really, really indulgent and thick, and you just want to have that hot chocolate. And then on the other hand, there's also the hot use case, obviously, that when you're at home, you know, rather than dealing with powder, trying to pour water in it, heat it up, do all of that, you can immediately, you know, just pour it in a mug, put it in a microwave, and be ready to go.
Brilliant.
So
what I was wondering when I was reading that, firstly, just what is it? And it's great to hear what it is. But secondly, it's how are you balancing these two things? Because I'm the CEO and founder of Pinnacle, and I know, like any founder or CEO of a company, there's so much to handle. How are you balancing these two things?
Oh, I think it's, look, for me, I always follow the mantra that I need people around me that are way better than I am. And so I'm trying to get the right team in place to do this. And, you know, for me, it's also about ultimately connecting pieces with each other. And I do think today's world, we have to be inspired by other areas of what we do. You know, we have to be Renaissance people in some ways, of not just looking at one thing, but being connected to other parts and other fields. And for me, learning about food science, for instance, and what's going on, our product is all natural. It's plant-based milks, for instance. Years ago, you wouldn't have done a hot chocolate with plant-based milks. Today, that's possible. So innovation happens in a lot of different places, but the methods of innovation, for instance, using science as an approach, using experiments as an approach, that's actually the same across different areas. So it's about connecting different domains, but seeing what are the commonalities. And that just excites me and gets me motivated. Yeah.
It makes so much sense. As you're saying that, I'm thinking about a lot of things that we've been talking about, or that I often think about myself. When you mentioned the idea of being a Renaissance man or woman, it makes sense when you say one thing can help another. So we did an event on creativity not too long ago. And for that event, we brought in a professor of creativity. Believe it or not, there's a professor of creativity in a school of creativity from Italy. And he was talking about what's the mechanisms that trigger creative thinking. And one of the key things he spoke about was your input determines your output. So the greater variety of input that you have in your thoughts, the more you're able to connect seemingly disconnected things to spark new ideas. So to me, that would make a lot of sense in what you're saying, that you're doing something which seemingly is outside of your day-to-day, but I could see how something in that space might trigger and inform new ideas. Plus, I guess you get to see what it's like to be the customer.
Absolutely.
Because at OptimizeD, you're providing marketing technology.
Absolutely.
But
Absolutely.
within the chocolate business, you're actually having to leverage that. So that does make a lot of sense.
Yeah. I think on this notion of creativity, this is why I'm such a big believer just in diversity in general. This is why your workforce needs to be diverse. Because you need diversity of thought. You need a diversity of ideas. And why does it matter is ultimately because you want to be creative. If you just do the same thing over and over again, you don't necessarily need diversity. But if you really want to be creative, it helps you to create new thoughts. I think that's why traveling, that's why different cultures are so powerful, because you get new ideas that you connect to each other.
Yeah.
And so this you know, and by the way, it's also interesting how many times, you know, this notion about serendipity, not knowing what necessarily to expect. When I started the hot chocolate business, I had no idea that I would be sitting here in Dubai with you having a conversation about it. But it turns into that. And I've had many conversations with people actually about that idea and that business, and then it connected into the conversation about Optimizely.
Yeah.
So we are not defined by only one thing we do in life. We are defined by our different experiences and how we connect them. And I think that's the exciting part. And you know this as a founder and entrepreneur of Pinnacle as well. You know, you start something and it engages people in interesting ways because they want to find out more about you and why you are doing this. And I found the same so far with the chocolate business. So I'm very happy that, you know, you can never know where it goes. You can never predict it. You know?
And I can see when you speak about it, it puts a smile on your face. I think even when I was told about it, it put a smile on my face. So it humanizes the whole experience. And I think you can't underestimate the power of something like that.
Absolutely.
You know, when you're talking about the diversity side of it, it also makes me think about this idea of there's so much focus right now on Gen Z, both in terms of marketers trying to reach Gen Z, but also in companies trying to hire them. And I think oftentimes that's because the idea is that they're digital natives, they understand the digital space better, they grew up with it. But I think coming back to the creativity part, I think it's also the fact that, and this is again from that professor of creativity that we were speaking to, he spoke about this idea of when you're younger, you're so much more open to exploring new things and new ideas, and that's partly why you end up becoming more creative. And so again, I think there's that interesting side of, and I'm feeling this now because, not that I'm so old, but I'm not so young. I'm probably somewhere in the middle, depending on how you look at it. But I'm already realizing, I'm seeing how my mind is changing, right? So I'm seeing how, as I progress into the later stages of my career, it's been 10, 15 years I've been doing this, my natural desire to take more risk, or my natural inclination of curiosity, I can feel it naturally diminishing a bit to where I have to make a conscious effort to ensure that I'm keeping those things alive. So yeah, I mean, just in the conversation of what we're talking about, that thing really stands out. And on this idea of risk-taking and creativity, I guess it's a really interesting segue into what I've been reading about Optimizely and what you're really promoting at the moment, which is this really interesting approach of experimentation, which I think speaks to me a lot and makes so much sense. Before we get to that, this idea of experimentation, I'd love to just do, because that's where we're currently at right now with Optimizely and with what technology is enabling. I'd love for the two of you to help me do a bit of a retrospective. How have we gone from where we were, let's say, 50 years ago, where marketing was all assumptions, emotions, and all about the creative, the art aspect of it, to where we're at now, where it's still very much art, but it's also very science. Could you guys help me to get that timeline in place and talk us through how we've got to this point?
Yeah. I mean, for me, marketing is always about the connection, obviously, at art and science. It also connects to your Gen Z example, because if you think about the challenges companies have to understand new technologies, I mean, TikTok is a perfect example, and how, today, and I don't think it has anything to do with your age, because I can relate to it really, really well, is ultimately, technology just moves ahead, and platforms like TikTok are so scientifically driven in terms of what you see, what your experience is like. And so some companies have completely made it part of the business model to be so scientific. But I think when you look at the history of marketing and then also digital marketing, I think for a long time, digital and actually your brand and your position and how marketers thought about building out their story was very much based on the brand aspect. You talked a lot about the brand, who your company is. I mean, take a company like Coca-Cola. You start off with an amazing brand identification. You have different touch points. You think about the 4 Ps, all of those sort of things as a marketer. Yeah? And then at one point, there was a shift that started to happen where marketing and the brand journey actually became the experience for a customer that actually got you the demand for your product. And suddenly it became around driving business for your company going forward. And it wasn't just good enough to be a good brand. Now you needed to start to really think about, how do I build demand? And then how do I deliver on my customer experience and on my brand promise in every touch point of my company? And then over time, and especially in, let's say, 2005, and then with the advent of the iPhone in 2007, 2008, it suddenly started to become that the digital experience was actually becoming synonymous with the customer experience. And there was no more difference. And I think a lot of companies realized fairly late that, for instance, their website is not just a window into their brand, but their website is actually their business. It's actually a business platform. It's actually something that actually drives demand. And now many of the companies we talk to every single day, for them, if their website is down, their business is down. Yeah, I mean, it becomes so important. And so now we've come to a place where people have started to realize, oh, my digital domain is actually my business. It's no longer like only a view into my brand. And that has completely changed what a marketer needs to be able to do today. The role of marketer is no longer just being able to do the creatives about the brand, a nice brand narrative. No, you need to own the pipeline, the demand for your business. You need to own the customer experience for your customers. That's a tall order, because you can't just be creative. You need to connect this to actually the data and the science behind it. And we can talk a lot more about that. But that's, for me, a little bit of this history about this transition. And I think a lot of it has all started with the fact that this device that we all carry along in our pocket consumerized every industry. Every market is now a consumer experience that people expect. You can be in the healthcare space, you can be in retail, you can be in manufacturing, you can be in oil and gas, it doesn't matter where. It's a consumerization that's driving so much change of what the marketer needs to be all about. You know?
100%. Yeah, it's a really good way to explain that. Is there anything you want to add to that, Jesper?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking, and one of the biggest challenges that I hear from marketeers is, just the ability to transition fast enough and keeping up with these changes, the amount of channels that they need to be not necessarily on, but at least aware of at any given time, and just how to respond to the demands of the consumers is quite fascinating. How they have gone from being these marketeers and now, as Alex says, a very tall order of kind of owning a lot of this pipeline and generation, while at the same time being sometimes hampered by the technologies that they have available to do that. So it's a very I think stressful job for a lot of marketeers to keep all these plates spinning at the same time. And so I have a lot of respect for the marketeers who are in that position, and that's obviously what we through our technology are trying to help with.
Yeah, and maybe just build on that, because you trigger a thought there, Jesper, for me, is I recently spoke to a customer who told me in the past we were able to tell customers to adapt to us. Yeah, we would put up a new experience, for instance, let's say a mobile app, and we would tell the customers, use this mobile app to transact with us. And he told me, you know what, that's no longer working. We need to adapt to where the customer is going and how they want to interact with us. So this is a huge mindset shift change that you need to have as a marketer and a company. You need to start to really think about, like, oh, the consumer wants to engage with me through the following means. Maybe they want to engage with me through a platform like, TikTok, etc. Then I need to be there. Yeah, and this is to this point that Jesper mentioned about this constant change and the speed of the change. It's all about, are you able to adapt to where your customer is, or do you fall behind and then you fall further and further behind and somebody else captures your business? But in every industry, I mean, think about financial services. Some banks thought they would never lose certain customers. And suddenly there's so many new banking options, so many new payment methods, etc. And it's because they're all coming about because somebody was not quick enough to adapt to how the customer wanted to actually do business with them. And then consumers go elsewhere.
100%. So many great thoughts there, and it triggered so many thoughts in my own mind. But to Jesper's point about the challenge to marketers, yeah, definitely. So the reason why Jesper and I know each other is we met at a conference that Pinnacle produced called the CET conference. We started this, 10 years ago? The whole concept around it was we were analyzing what was happening in different spaces, and that just stood out to me as such a major game changer, to see how technology is coming into the marketing environment and changing how consumers engage with the company. And hence why we created the conference. The idea is to help educate and help them to shift them along that timeline. Because like you said, a marketer, let's say someone who's a CMO who might have graduated 20, 30 years ago, what they studied at that time is so dramatically different to where we're currently at. And again, to your point, because Alex, you spoke about this in a speech that I was listening to, where you spoke about the idea that the gap is widening. So the people who are at the front of that digital innovation are getting further out, and then the rest are kind of getting left behind, which is interesting because I think what digital first brought on was it almost not leveled, but it created a certain amount of leveling of the playing field, because you'd have someone like a kid sat in their bedroom and they were able to get an e-commerce store up and running and suddenly be marketing and be out there. And so it enabled so many people to get entry into the game and start businesses. But I think those same people now need to be aware that there's a new level that it's progressing to. And if they don't clue into that, they're going to be left behind, right? And I think that's a big part of your message.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a widening gap. I mean, you take the United States, for instance, there are 4 companies now that make up 25% of the GDP, that have trillion-dollar valuations, And then there are so many companies, I think at the very small business end, yes, it's easier to start a new company. But think about all the companies that are very good brands, but whose business is declining or stagnating. And it is pretty shocking that 20 plus years ago, Jeff Bezos, for instance, talked about the idea that why is Amazon different is because they fail fast, they experiment more, they test more, and they just do it faster than anybody else. You take Tesla today. Why is Tesla's widening their gap to other auto manufacturers? Because they're collecting more data every single day. And so you see certain patterns come about over and over again. And this widening gap is really a question in terms of how can certain brands sustain themselves. Yeah. It's not that they might survive, but they're not thriving. They're not capturing any of that growth. And so we see it as one of our roles at Optimized is to actually help customers continue to thrive in this market and not just survive.
100%.
And that's what we're trying to accomplish.
I'd love to get into that aspect now because you said it perfectly there. And again, isn't it crazy that Jeff Bezos said this, 20 years ago?
20 years ago, yeah.
It is, and then at the same time, it isn't crazy because they are leading. So it kind of makes sense that he knew that he was aware of this philosophy and the approach of testing, experimenting, and trying to fail in order to find the best way. Let's dissect what that means. Before you do, though, I think a good example to what you're talking about right now is, that always comes to my mind, is Domino's Pizza. So I think a lot of us in this space know the CEO had made this announcement some time ago that Domino's Pizza it's a pizza company secondarily, but it's primarily a technology company. That was the ethos that he really led the company forward with. And then they essentially leveraged all the tech in their marketing and their customer experience to ensure that the map, the mobile app rather, the website experience, the whole journey is incredibly seamless and engaging, and that's how they want to win the marketplace. And if you see how Domino's stock performed over the past few years, they outperformed some of the biggest tech companies even. So that's a really interesting example, because I think sometimes people only go to the digital companies when they think of the importance of digital CX, but it's not. It's an every company scenario. Right.
Yeah, and I think to your point there, second point, we spoke about before how this, the challenge for the marketeer has over the years evolved and changed rapidly. And also from a, CIO perspective in terms of keeping up with the technologies. But Alex made a point earlier today, we were talking about how, this is a CEO priority now. And it was the CEO of Domino's coming out, right? It was not the CMO or the CIO. It's a CEO priority. It's a matter of how your company survives in this environment, and not just leave it to the CMO to fix it, right? It's really that's quite interesting how the priority has really changed over this period as well.
Can I ask you an honest question on that one, Jesper? Because you've been in this space for so long, actually speaking to the companies on a daily basis. And this is across several regions, so it's not about any one country. Across all the regions where you've been working, in general, what have you noticed? How many of the CEOs are actually taking that step and taking it that seriously? Or how many of them are still just leaving it to marketing and digital teams?
I think, at least in my experience, it has it has changed over the last couple of years, but I think in general, especially in the more emerging markets, it has been slightly slower on the uptake than we've seen in North America and Europe, for sure. But they're getting there, and they're understanding the importance now more so than they were just a few years ago. So I think there's been a lot of realignment at the top levels in a lot of the organizations, and at least in my experience when talking to customers, you see that the maturity level is increasing, but they're still, it's still very difficult for them to keep up. And making sure that you in emerging markets have access to the right skill levels that you need in order to do that. It's quite a leap for a lot of organizations.
Yeah, it is, and it comes back to what we said earlier about moving outside of your immediate space, right? When we're speaking about the other companies and the things that you're doing, Alex, I can imagine why it would be a stretch, because previously there's this real silo effect in companies that's always been there. Like, this is my department and this is my area, and that really can't happen anymore if you want to succeed. And I think that's something that Optimizely works on a lot, is removing the silos, and particularly what I really liked about a lot of the case studies that you guys were showing was this combination of the product team and the marketing team. That made a lot of sense to me, and why that's behind the success of so many companies. Could you speak to that, Alex, on why that's so important and how you enable that?
It comes back a little bit to that evolution of marketing that we spoke about before, but marketing owns the story of the company. It owns the content. It owns the purpose of the brand. Yeah. But where marketers sometimes fall short on is the notion of a product mindset, which means, how do I think about product development in the sense of agility relative to testing things out quickly and moving things forward? And many of the companies, and I think Domino's is an excellent example, as you mentioned, is this recognition of, like, we need to act more like a technology company. And what does it actually mean? It's more the culture that we are operating under. It doesn't mean that the pizzas suddenly become, filled with chips or something. Yeah. They don't become, the pizzas are still pizzas. But you start to think about, like, hey, what if we applied a way of thinking like a product company to our digital experience, for instance? We would, for instance, update our app much more often. We would release new features much more frequently. And this is the part where many companies, another good one is Saks Fifth Avenue, the big retailer in the US. They just completely changed their team and their focus really on building out saksfifthavenue.com as a product. They brought in a lot of different skill sets into their management team to actually start this evolution that you're speaking to with the Domino's case, which is you want to bring marketers and product people together, both mindsets, onto one way of actually operating a company. Because if you think about it from a CEO perspective, you need to have people on your leadership team who actually can combine that creative component with that agility thinking. So you need to combine purpose and agility in one way. And this is how you transform yourself into a technology company, because technology companies are not just technology either. They typically have a purpose and a product, and you need to do the same as a company. And so our view is, it doesn't matter if you're in marketing or in product, you need to own growth for the business. There needs to be a growth leader. And that growth leader might have the title of CEO, CDO, CMO, CPO, whatever it is. But that person needs to really be connected to, like, how do I unleash growth for my business? And you can only do it by actually being able to create an experience that's both compelling, but that keeps being agile. And this is why you need product and marketing on one platform.
Makes perfect sense. Product and engineering have such a great way of iterative improvements.
Yes.
If they work in a normal sense,
yes.
right?
Yes.
You're constantly looking for those small steps and innovations. Marketing have a great understanding of customer and, as you said, storytelling and how to connect. So it makes so much sense why you want to bring those two things together. What's really interesting for me about what Optimizely is doing, and where it speaks to me, I think, on a level of how I like to approach life, but also business, is this idea of risk-taking and innovation. So if we look at where so many companies have gone wrong, it's often in either they've overstepped the mark in innovation, they've made a change that just didn't work, they've taken too far of a risk, or they haven't made any change at all. You know, we're all familiar with examples like, let's take Nokia. It's the most classic example of a company that failed to innovate and change in the right way. What you're doing enables a company to make those changes and innovations, but to limit the risk that goes into doing that, right? Could you speak to how that's possible? What is this experimentation culture that your type of product Optimizely enables?
Yeah, there's a lot to it. Maybe just the origin of Optimizely as a company is already helpful. But it was during the Obama campaign, when Obama first ran for office in the US, where actually Optimizely was founded from. Because Obama was running and was trying to raise funds. And you know, if you think about it, you could get an email that says, donate now, or it could say, you know, support change. Yeah. And so they tested every single permutation of how to actually ensure that you maximize getting results. And it was the first campaign in modern history that really became a digital first political campaign in terms of the fundraising, et cetera. And that's how Optimizely actually started. This was where the product first was developed from this notion about what content works best in what circumstance. And today, when you think about Optimizely, we actually have a full platform, a digital experience platform that connects content with experimentation and commerce capabilities and customer data, because we truly believe that creating content, working with content needs to be directly embedded of actually, you know, experimenting and testing at all times. Because ultimately, you want to drive conversions, you want to show the right person the right sort of content, and also in the right way. And that's what our platform allows you to do. But coming back to your question, the reason why it ultimately works is because we all deal with uncertainty. And the antidote to uncertainty is testing. Because how else do you know if one is better than the other? You know, I think the big elephant in the room is always that you have the highest person in the room. Yeah, in this case, a hippo, not an elephant. Yeah, but you have a hippo, you know, who comes in and basically says, oh, I think this is the way it should look. This is the way what we should do. But you actually have no data to really support this. And the conversation completely changes once you introduce some data into the conversation. Because we could all have an argument about something. But in the moment we stop being like a cult leader where we just think like, oh, this is just my opinion because I believe this. But we can actually have a conversation around data. The conversation in the room completely changes. Yeah? And I've experienced this myself in multiple cases. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say to your point on that, I think you published, as a company, you published an article from Harvard Business Review or Harvard University, I believe, where you looked at the seniority of a person involved in the experimentation. And what stood out to me in that was that it showed that when you've got somebody very senior involved in that process, the likelihood of success does increase. But the uptake, the actual change is not as significant as when that person isn't involved. And that really made the point to me of, well, companies, and even for myself, we all have to be careful. Once you've got like a CEO or a very senior manager involved in a meeting, it's only natural. Everybody's going to have a bias towards his idea, his perspective. And no matter how good that person is, that's only one viewpoint on the situation. So it ends up making you one-dimensional. As you said, I mean, at its worst example, it's almost like a cult leader. But yeah, it spoke to me a lot. The antidote, as you said, to that is data. It makes you objective. It removes you from those types of biases.
Yeah, right? And it also comes back to what Jesper spoke about earlier, that you have so much change and so many different channels, for instance, coming up. So how do you know if you are supposed to invest in them or not? Yeah, how can you minimize the risk of not doing it, but also maximizing the opportunity if you did? And a lot of times it's obviously decisions where I think companies always think like black and white, yes or no, and, oh, I need to commit this much to an initiative. There are ways to test the initiative so that you don't commit to the same level of risk right away. And in some ways, I think it's a very human thing that we all have before we make a big commitment, we kind of want to test the water if that commitment actually will work out. And testing allows you to actually test the water. There's a concept in testing called the painted door. Yeah? And the painted door is this idea that you basically take any wall that you can see and you just paint something on the wall, but it's still a wall. But you see if people will actually use it. So you can do this online as well. You can, for instance, on a website, create a button and you can say like, you know, go here. If you're Domino's Pizza, you could get a button called chicken wings. Yeah, and you could find out how many people will click on chicken wings. Now, there's nothing behind the button. You know, Domino's Pizzas doesn't do chicken wings yet. You know, but you could have it as a button, and you could tell how many people actually clicked on it in a certain time period. Yeah, and that would be a very simple test. Now, if the test fails, oh, good, you didn't invest into a chicken wing factory, you didn't invest into chicken wing delivery, you avoided a lot of costs. But if a lot of people click on it, you can suddenly see like, oh, maybe we should be in the chicken wing business. So now you took a decision that is actually otherwise an extraordinarily big decision to make. And you completely de-risked it, yeah? But at the same time, you introduce data to it. And it completely changes your decision making.
I love that example. Yeah, because you're right. Something, it may seemingly seem like a small decision, but that could be factories, supply chains, so much investment would have gone into that in the past. As you said, you'd have to do a lot of research before, but you'd have no absolute way of knowing. Yeah. But suddenly you're able to see if demand is really there, and then you're able to act on it.
Yeah. And a lot of the research is oftentimes broken or flawed when you, for instance, do user groups. You know, I could, for instance, sit us in a room and we could ask the question and say like, oh, how likely, you know, do you want Domino's to provide you chicken wings? And then people share opinions. But opinions are very different than actual behaviors. Mm-hmm. Behaviors and opinions are oftentimes different. I might say like, oh, you know, I only read books from the top literature, etc. But what I really read is, you know, science fiction novels and whatever, you know. So that the point is, what we say and what we do are oftentimes two different things. Now, what you test for and what you experiment is actual activities and behaviors. So this is the power of it. It takes away both the assumption of the person making a decision, but it also takes away the opinion of the consumer, and it actually looks at their behaviors. And I think that's a very, very powerful thing to do, because it takes away, again, any of that
the guesswork.
The guesswork.
Yeah, 100%. A good example that comes to mind for me was we were speaking to somebody from Angami at one of our events, and he was talking about how they used, I think, a similar testing approach. They'd created, you must have heard of Shazam, where you can, you hear a music in the environment, you press the button, it tells you what the music is. So they added that feature to their music app. And it was interesting because when they added it, they expected it to be a really interesting feature. It's a music app, and it has the ability to search for what that music in your environment is on the press of a button. So they placed a really big banner and put it on the top of the app, expecting this massive like reaction and uptake, and it was not what they'd expected. It was much lower. So it was only when they did some testing and they created a couple of, because this whole process of experimentation starts with creating hypotheses, right? So you have to hypothesize on what might be the scenario. And so one of the hypotheses was, maybe it looks like an advertisement, and so people aren't clicking on it. Maybe if we make it look like it's part of the app, that might make a difference. And when they tested that, it actually worked. So interestingly, instead of making it more prominent and bigger and at the top, when they just made it a smaller, integrated looking feature, it suddenly had much more reaction, which goes against what probably most people naturally would have leaned towards, and just stood out to me as a really good, simple, but highly effective example of what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And you find lots and lots of examples where things are maybe counterintuitive to the assumptions that you would make about it. And ultimately, that's where you want to remove the guesswork and the hippo thinking and actually become much more data-driven. But it's an important realization that every experiment you run, be it successful or not successful, is actually providing value to your organization. Because if something fails and you have a hypothesis and it fails, it's still a cost avoidance because you're not pursuing a wrong business idea.
Right.
On the other hand, obviously, if something succeeds, it's millions of potential benefit that you have. And that's the part where oftentimes organizations need to recognize it's not just about the winners in an experiment. It's also about the fact that if you fail, you actually learn from every failure that you have. And that's like this digital mindset that really has more to do with a cultural transformation to do this. But I love the example that you just gave, and there's a lot of them that are sometimes counterintuitive.
I would love to ask the two of you, like, what are some of your favorite examples that you've seen, either in that space of experimentation or in the usage of digital technologies in the marketing space? What are some examples of both of your companies that you both really like in that regard?
Yeah, I can give you a couple of examples from our customers. One of them is Fitbit. Yeah, and Fitbit is a great story because as a marketer, think about it, the technology on the Fitbit continuously improves and the chips are able to do so much more. So as a marketer, which of these features do you market, which ones do you promote, etc. And then also, how do you design the app, the Fitbit app, to actually show you the capabilities of your ever-growing device? And there was one great story for them, which was their chip allows you now to measure blood oxygen level in your oxygen, your blood levels in your oxygen. And that was something that was 4 levels down in their app. Nobody cared for it in some ways. But then COVID hit, and they ran an experiment and put that feature up to the very top of the navigation and the app. And they saw suddenly it was one of the most wanted things. And so what they do as a company is they bring engineering, the people who develop the device, together with the people who create the software for the app, together with the marketing team. And they look every week at what are the things that we learn from the experiments that we run. And it suddenly changed the positioning that marketers then used externally to talk about the features and capabilities of the latest Fitbit device. But it's kind of connecting, again, that engineering and marketing conversation into one platform. So I thought it was really interesting. Another very counterintuitive example is, we have a lot of customers who are, for instance, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. And one of them told me the simple example of how do you recommend an article? So you go to the website and you want to see articles recommended to you. And there's one feature that's called Hear What Other People Are Reading, the most read articles. And at the same time, this company invested a lot of money to build out their own recommendation engines, own AI-driven recommendation engines. These are the articles you should be reading. And they ran a test between the most read articles versus our sophisticated technology recommending you articles. Guess which test won out? It actually showed that people were going for the most read articles. And that was counterintuitive for that publisher because they had thought like, oh, we spent so much money developing this technology. But people were most curious to just read what other people read. And then a lot of examples around really the process of, for instance, in e-commerce, just around checkout and how you check out a product. And I one crazy story was from one customer. They added an emoji, a smiley face, to the buy now button. And that proved to be one of the key drivers for more sales. Wow. It's just giving somebody a positive reinforcement of like, hey, here's a smiley face on the button. But these are the type of things, again, you can test, you have no idea if it actually works, and they saw it. And a lot of times when I think about companies that really have adopted that digital mindset, it's really companies who have these sort of stories to share internally, and then it becomes really a movement inside the business. And then you look back at it one point and you ask yourself, how did we ever do this without that? And that's a powerful moment.
And I think it's interesting when we look at the way that people are starting to do experimentation, and I'm just thinking about how, as you say, it's the mindset of the company, and it starts obviously with the CEO, but it also requires you to hire in a certain way. You need to hire people who understand this way of analyzing and looking at data and using this to drive the company forward. So it's interesting how it's kind of spreading across the entire organizations into HR and other parts of the organization that's ultimately will help drive this forward to the next level. It's quite the recruitment strategy, no longer just on the marketing team. Absolutely. It's spreading across, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that point definitely stood out to me when I was looking at it. It's definitely not, because there's so much data science, there's so much product development, and then there's all the marketing aspect, and then the CEO. So you're really trying to bring everybody together, which is, I guess, why having a platform that can allow you to have a visual and connect everybody makes so much sense.
Yeah, and that was also part for us to build out our solutions beyond the experimentation point, to say like, look, we actually are connecting content with experimentation and all the workflows that a marketer goes through. Because if you think about the marketer's life today, it's so complicated in terms of all the different inputs you're getting, the requirements, and then we're in a hybrid work environment where some people work remotely, some people in the office. Everything is changing around you. And so marketing can become very busy about the work itself rather than getting work done. Yeah. And so one of the things we have done in our platform is to really orchestrate the marketing workflows. So, data is exploding, the number of assets you use as a marketer is exploding, the number of campaigns you want to run is exploding. How do you manage this chaos, basically? Yeah, and that's what we made an acquisition recently of a company called Welcome Software. That's the very core of them, is to actually orchestrate this workflow for the marketer, because ultimately, you want to start to collaborate with everyone in the company around the campaigns you're running. But when I go to my chief marketing officer, I want to know what campaigns are we in the market with? How effective are they? When are we launching this? When are we launching that? And so having that calendar view, having able to have transparency as an organization, knowing what hypotheses you want to test, knowing how these tests are running, all of this needs to be orchestrated today. And in order to scale this, you need platforms who can support you in that.
Yeah, I agree with that. When I was looking at the stages of maturity,
yes,
and I was analyzing at which point would something like a platform be really necessary. And I suppose it depends on the ambitions of the company. And I could see why at the beginning somebody could do very simple A/B testing, right? You can test two ideas. At any point. You could be a one-man startup and test out two different ideas, which is good. I think the experimentation mindset makes a lot of sense. You evaluate one idea against another. But I think the research that stood out to me was the one that looked at how the number of variants translates to the amount of success and then the innovation. So, and again, this was, I think, something that was reflected in the Harvard review and in what you guys put out as well. So most companies only test on two variants. I believe it was something like 70% or more.
Correct. Yes.
Only test on two variants.
Yes.
And something like only 3% test on more than five variants. But that's where the major success is. And again, that made sense to me, because if you're testing on two variants, you're normally you're very much within the status quo. You're not going too far out as far as, well, how far can we stretch this? How crazy can we get with ideas? But when you start going into 4, 5, and 6 and beyond, you're really putting in completely outside of the box thinking and really being able to see how far it can go, how much innovation you can get. And I guess that's where platforms are necessary, right?
100%. So a lot of the research that you're referring to, we collaborate with MIT, with Harvard and others together to develop more of this, again, scientific mindset. That's the beauty of it. It's obviously statistical analysis and statistics based. So you can go pretty deep. And to your point of bias, in a lot of cases, when you develop an hypothesis and then think about what you're testing for, you actually start to apply your bias right away in terms of what you think are the most likely outcomes. While when you do a multivariate test, you go beyond your bias in the organization and you actually truly test different scenarios.
If I can just add a point to that, because some people will be aware and some won't. I've always been quite fascinated by the idea of the psychology influencing things around us. And when you speak on this point of bias, one of the main biases that we all have is confirmation bias, right? Which is simple idea that we naturally want to confirm what we already believe. So if you've only got two, as you said, the bias is to just confirm what we already believe. You're not really getting to the point of innovation. So that makes a lot of sense to me.
And this is why many companies, by the way, that we work with that really are very, very successful on using experimentation, make it very easy for other people to contribute ideas into it, because you want to source ideas from many parts of your organization to actually remove that bias, be this confirmation bias. And in some ways, if you just confirm you already believes, you're not getting a lot of additional value
100%.
out of the program itself. But this is why, again, it's much more of this cultural transformation rather than just like, oh, I'm applying a tool here. Otherwise, everybody would be doing it.
Yeah.
It requires really a different way of working.
100%. I think there was the Booking.com's product head who spoke about this idea of how there's two main things that he takes as a mindset.
Yeah.
And one of them is the willingness to be wrong and fail every day, right?
Yes.
So in other words, putting those experiments into place, having an idea of how it should go, and then finding out the data proves you wrong.
Yes.
And the other one is being okay with the idea that your team or your employees are going to shape how the business runs. And I would even take it a step further, your customers shape how the business goes.
100%. I can tell you our own example of this. My chief marketing officer would tell you this example if she was here. But literally, we relaunched our website on our own technology. We did a whole transformation project, also brought multiple sites together. And it was about the navigation bar and what words should be in the navigation bar. And initially, I had a very strong view that I wanted the word customers in our navigation bar. And the team ran a couple of tests, and then afterwards were able to show me that customers were actually not clicking on the word customers in the navigation bars. They wanted to know about our products, about the plans we provide, etc. So they were able to tell me better based on the data. But it's exactly that notion about being willing, also even as a CEO of the company, to just say like, look, I can be absolutely wrong in my assumptions that I'm making, because I actually are just assuming what I think I might want to see or what customers might want to see. And that was just a good example of just applying this notion about being totally fine with being wrong.
Yeah, it's a great philosophy for everything, right? Not just work. We're talking a lot about data, and so it would be natural to bring up the topic that I think is on a lot of people's minds, particularly customers, and it's the idea of data privacy. Cookies are now changing. There's a whole movement around that. What are your thoughts on that? How is that shaping the industry moving forward? What does it mean for the digital experience environment?
Yeah, from my perspective, the most important thing companies need to do is they need to really have a first-party data strategy, meaning you cannot rely just on third-party data.
And for anyone who's not familiar, should we just unpack what that means?
Yeah, sure,
Versus first party.
Absolutely, yeah. One view is like the data that you really collect and own of your customers. That's the first-party data. Versus third-party data where you infer your customer's interest based on cookie values, meaning activities that they might have done on different sites or for where they come from, etc.
And do you not feel? I feel like as a customer myself, that makes me more comfortable as well. So not the idea that a company's just taken my data when I've just logged onto a website and a cookie's just been taken without me even opting in. But rather, I'm a customer of this gym and I've given them my data and they're providing me an experience and I'm paying for that and I want that experience to be as good as possible. And so they're going to use the data that I've optionally given them and then use that to enhance my experience. That feels a lot more comfortable. Yeah. Would that be your perspective as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting, for almost the entirety of the time I've been in the digital experience business, we've been talking about, back in the day, we had a term called the creepy line, right? So it was about, how far can you push it in terms of using data to drive a better experience for customers without becoming a little bit too, customers feeling uncomfortable about you knowing too much about them. And I think that's very much where we are now as well. Personally, I know that I have zero objections in people having my data as long as they use it to create a better experience for me. But as soon as I feel like they're overstepping their boundaries or they're using that data in a way that I don't feel comfortable with, that's when I back off. Yeah. All right. And I think a lot of people out there are quite similar, right? We all want less spam in our inbox. If you can send me something that's targeted and relevant, I appreciate that. So I think ultimately it's for the good of the customers that we can use the first-party data to create a better experience and be less creepy in the way that we communicate.
Yeah. It really is a trade-off between convenience and sharing of data. And if you can make the case that sharing more data gets you better and convenient experience, you're willing to take the trade-off. We also did a whole study of our customers and consumers as well that we sponsored. And it's very clear that also generationally there's a change happening where, younger generations become increasingly comfortable with sharing data. And so I think sometimes public policy setting is just lagging behind in terms of where markets actually are moving. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes when I hear some of the headlines about GDPR and I look at, my nephew and others who what data they share, they don't share the same concerns that maybe, certain public policy makers necessarily share. So I think there's also a difference that happens there. But I would say ultimately for companies to navigate this space that's ever changing, I think it's just a good business practice to put in place a plan of how do we actually connect with our customers? What data do we collect about our customers directly? Because that data is your own data. You own that data, And then how do I use this data actually in such a way that it doesn't come across creepy, that it comes across as creating a better experience? And that's where a huge opportunity lies. But I think there are too many marketers sometimes focused on trying to collect or buy data from different places, stitch it together, versus truly owning the relationship and building that relationship. And I think that's a big opportunity.
Could I ask you to elaborate a little bit more on that, on that difference of the marketer who is just trying to grab the data from anywhere, buy it, versus owning? What does that look like if you were to elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think, but number one is you need to invest in this. So why do marketers go to other places to collect data? Is oftentimes because the customer actually starts engaging with your brand on places where you don't actually have ownership of the data. They might come in through a marketplace, for instance, to buy something that's not, you might not even know that your customer bought something there. Mm. So you need to invest in developing a first relationship, that they actually come to your site, to your app, that they actually start engaging with you directly, so that you can actually get customer information. I mean, 80-90% of traffic to a website is unknown. How do you start to get to know this customer? Where we have a whole solution actually built around, for instance, being able to stitch together profiles of customers purely based on their interests that they show on your website. Mm-hmm. You don't even know the name of the customer yet, but you can at least start to infer what they're interested in based on what topics they're browsing on your site. You need to invest in your own content. Develop your own content so that people come to your site, rather than third-party content. So you want to really build out that relationship with a customer, just like a retailer in the physical world would actually want to have a shopper come to your own site so that you can develop a relationship and get to know the customer. If they only go to a mass retailer, you will never know who this customer is who is buying from you. It's no different in the digital world, But I think a lot of companies are underinvested in their own content development. Thought leadership is oftentimes not there. And I think marketers can do a lot more to kind of connect with consumers.
To have a direct connection point as opposed to having it happening in other environments.
That's it.
Okay, so on this idea of data privacy, it's something that's been spoken about so much. I just want to touch a little bit more on that. A lot of people still have a lot of concerns around it, yet it makes up such an inevitable part of any business environment has to have data on a customer. It doesn't matter what that business is, but there's still the struggle in this space, right? And concerns and doubts. What's your perspective on that? What would you like to share, and what advice would you give to that?
Yeah, I would probably pass on a piece of advice that I received in my own personal and professional career always, which was the greatest challenges also give you the greatest opportunity. And I think for companies, there's an opportunity to actually build out that first-party data strategy that allows them to create a very trust-based relationship with their customers. And that can actually differentiate them going forward. In today's world, there's absolutely the ability for any company to be ahead of any regulatory changes about how data is being used by just doing what's natural, which is connecting with your customer. Just as you would have done in the physical world to actually know your customer directly, be transparent about what data you're collecting from them as you are building out your digital experience, and you will be totally fine. Anytime you start to get too complicated in terms of trying to get all this data collected from other places, etc., it's a slippery slope. So stay, I think, on this path of owning the relationship of the customer, understanding who your customer actually is. And I think for many brands, this is absolutely doable today at scale. Optimized, as well as a lot of other companies, provide, I think, great technologies to help customers solve that challenge better than ever before.
100%. It's almost like how Jesper was speaking about earlier, this idea of bringing it back to the physical experience, right? Mm-hmm. So you were saying you go to buy a suit, there's a relationship you have with that person.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, the idea of a clothing store, right? You walk in and you might have a relationship with the salesperson there, and they know your preferences, they know your size, they know what
which is data
previously bought, etc. So they have all this data themselves. Yeah. Now, if I walked into the store and they started talking about what I bought somewhere else, in the meantime, that third-party data that they heard somewhere, I might feel that was a little bit out of line and a little bit weird to bring into the conversation. So ultimately, if I'm in the store and I get that experience and they're using the data in the right way, that to me is what I expect in a physical world, and I would expect no less in a digital world.
I think that's probably one of the best ways to put it, actually, when you put it like that, because if I go to the same coffee shop all the time and the person behind the counter now knows, like most of us, what I want to have, that's something that makes me want to go back there. It's part of my bond and my customer loyalty. There's nothing strange about it. But yeah, as you said, it's only if they were to go and find out something behind my back, that would be strange, right? And the direction that Optimizely and first-party data moves away from that. It's cookies. Third-party data is that more going behind somebody and getting something that they wouldn't even know that you would have. Mm. And that, I think, is probably the best way to put it across. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I think, coming back to you talking earlier about like the human psychology of building that trust relationship with the person on the other side, we're also creatures of habit. Right, so we like to repeat things. We like to see them play out. And I also had a while ago I was reading about how long-term versus short-term memory works in storing bad experiences. Right, we tend to remember bad experiences much longer because we need to learn to avoid them again. And so we're programmed to avoid these bad experiences and go back to the good ones. As humans. So there's really some interesting things when you start digging into the psychology of how we work and how a salesperson in a store should capture data and interact with us.
You're right. And I think ultimately it comes back to that idea of it's not the tool, but the person handling the tool, right? So it's not so much about data as much as it is about the ethics of the company that's got the data, because every company, by nature of doing your work, even if you're only processing transactions, you've got data on all your customers. That's a part of doing business. It comes down to your personal ethics. How are you going to leverage that data? If you're going to use that data, for me, if it means when I get onto that plane, I've got the food that I want, and it's served to me in a way that I want, or I've got the right type of pillow, whatever that might be. If it enhances my experience, I'm happy to opt into that. By all means, the company could say, if you don't want to have that, if you want to keep it standard, opt out. And that for me feels ethical, and it feels like it's going to add to the customer, not take away. So yeah, it definitely feels like we're in a scenario where people have to take responsibility for how they choose to use the data, right? It's not the data is bad in and of itself. Yeah.
And I think to that point that, it's something that I think we've seen evolve over the last probably 5 to 10 years gradually. And I think I remember being at a conference some years ago, and I heard a speaker talking about how he was staying in a particular hotel chain, generally 5-star type hotels. And they had all this data about exactly what you say. You know, what pillow did he like? What type of beverages would he typically drink from the minibar? So it would be stocked up extra on those types of beverages, and they would have the right type of nuts that he would usually eat when he was in the room. All these little micro moments that he would pay attention to. And it just made that whole experience so much more enjoyable for him, frictionless. And that started, I think, a number of years ago in the little bit more luxury end of the market, whether it's airline or hotels or others. But there's no reason with the amount of data that is available today that it cannot, be available anywhere.
Yeah, it's very true.
So it might have started somewhere, but in certain segments, but it is readily available today.
And we've almost come to expect it, right? It's almost strange if somebody doesn't know you now and know how they should tailor the experience for you, that now feels strange. So the one size fits all approach just doesn't feel like it's the norm anymore, right?
Yeah. I mean, so many companies and so many marketers still dream about the segment of one, and not to segment customers on big groups. And to Jesper's point, there's a lot of technology today that brings you very close to this. But I think it all comes back to marketers recognizing that there's a science to growth. Yeah, there's a science to success. It's not guesswork. It's not random. There's literally playbooks that other companies have done. And Amazon is being always called out as the example because they have done this at the greatest scale possible, where we all feel we can actually get an experience that allows us to do something quickly, but it's personalized. And there's a science and there's pieces that any company can today leverage in their own operations about how they handle customer data, how they use experimentation, how they adopt really that digital mindset. And the biggest change that I've seen across our 9,000 customers, the ones who are starting off versus the ones that are highly, highly successful, it's all a matter of maturity as a company, about how mature you are. It has actually less to do with, necessarily one specific thing, etc. It has more to do with, am I maturing as a company to actually understand how to take advantage of the capabilities that are out in the marketplace yet. And it's our mission and vision as a business to make that sophisticated, what seems to be so sophisticated, to make it simpler for companies to adopt it. Yeah, that's what we want, but it's all based on how mature your business is to actually get there. And I think for marketeers, it's a super exciting time.
Yeah. And what I always find interesting is it reminds me of this book I read called The Slight Edge. And this is something I read right at the start of my career, and it influenced so much of my thinking. And it was built on this idea that most people think of major successes as this quantum leap, as the guy put it in this book, right? This major innovation change. And I think a lot of people approach business like that. We all have those friends who are just trying to find that next great idea to make a business. But the truth of it is that most successes are not this one great leap. It's like a million tiny steps. And I know that that's what the company that you're working with is built on, that premise, right? I think that's where the name comes from, optimizing,
absolutely,
making those small changes. And when I think of an Amazon, they didn't just end up with this site that suddenly just, it's every day looking at how can that person find that product easier? How can that button be? And it's several tiny steps that over time keep the thing moving.
Yeah, to exactly that point, a lot of people think digital transformation is this step change and leap. It's actually incrementalism. It's a power of incremental changes, all adding to it. It's like every day you change something by a percentage point, 50 days later, you're not 50% better, you're actually 500% better. It's because this power of incrementalism building on top of each other. There's this powerful breakthrough idea. I just had one customer tell me that, and he literally used these words where he said, I can't believe how much gold is right in front of us. Yeah? Not by designing new products, by launching new services, but by just doing better of the things that we have. And that's the idea of obviously optimizing what you have, optimizing what you've invested in, rather than coming up with something completely new. You can absolutely take advantage of what you have today and really optimize it for value. And that's this power of incrementalism, and that's applying a scientific method.
Brilliant.
And I think actually that it's interesting. I was just thinking that it's fascinating to me how there's so much talk in the market about the digital transformation. And it almost seems like for a long time that it was thought of this big bang where everything is going to transform magically, but it is really digital incrementalism that we're looking for, right? It is taking those incremental steps which eventually will lead to the transformation.
It's such an important philosophy to have, right? Because I think so many people get lost in, they never make any steps because they're looking for the leap and they can't find it. But it's a myth, really. It is just, you've got to just look for the tiny innovations that constantly build up to that. So looking outside of this then, obviously we've spoken a lot about this idea of experimentation, about the science of marketing. Outside of this, what other marketing trends are you seeing that are really influencing this year and the coming couple of years ahead?
Yeah, so some of them I really have to do a little bit about, obviously where your customer is at, etc. But I think for companies, especially on the business to business side, to understand everything that touches your account more broadly, really this concept of account-based marketing, but really about account-based management is, I think, on the business to business side, a massive trend, being able to pick up more signals from your customers to understand their interest, their propensity to buy. We actually work with several hundred different technology providers together in our platform because ultimately, I always look at Optimizely as part of an ecosystem that actually surrounds our customers to develop value with. So I would never think that everything a marketer does just happens in Optimizely. There's a lot of other parts. But what I see a lot of really, really great innovation in is on the analytical side of how to use analytics better, how to make them more available to the marketer, and how, especially on the business to business side, get this account-based approach really, really going. And then on the consumer side, I think it continues to be lots and lots of innovation in payments. I think in the tech around anything that touches the end of the process, but also a lot more about, beyond the initial purchase, the engagement afterwards, topics like loyalty, and actually rethinking loyalty completely away from like, oh, it's a loyalty program, but really understanding what drives loyalty with your company. I think a lot of times with marketing, you spend a lot of time talking about how do I gain a new customer. I think in marketing, the conversation about how do you keep your existing customers and do more with them is still a conversation that I think deserves more attention.
So on the topic of loyalty then, if you're saying the traditional approach has always been loyalty schemes, right? Or programs with the cards and the points. If you're saying to go beyond that, what does that look like if you're trying to get past that point?
Yeah, so I just read a case study of a company called Ulta Beauty. It's basically a beauty parlor chain, very, very successful in the US. I don't think they're yet in the Middle East or in Europe, but their whole philosophy was beyond the loyalty points. How do we start to engage with our customers? Really about understanding their facial treatments, what type of products they like, etc. And how do we start to marry the kind of idea of loyalty with really a deep understanding of who the customer is, rather than just collecting points, to actually improving the experience that they have, and then actually building out based on the subscription programs to our products, for instance. Maybe somebody wants to do something every month or every 2 months. And how do we bundle services together into meaningful packages for our customers, so that we're not just trying to collect points or trying to say something, use us more, but in a smarter way, figure out how will it actually change the way we, how it will change the way we actually package and bundle products for our customers. So they took it a bunch of steps further, And I think it comes back to this whole notion that we always talk about, which is, it's a better customer experience, and it provides you as a customer more choice. And loyalty actually became another word for I understand you. I understand what you would look for. Yeah, it's a little bit to the example that Jesper provided before with the hotel. It's the same sort of idea. How do we understand you better? Just being part of a loyalty program, but they don't really understand me better, could actually lead to the opposite effect, that you're like, oh, I'm part of a loyalty program, but they still treat me the same way as before. Yeah.
And I think that there's also the intersection of loyalty and advocacy. Right?
Big time.
Because in today's world, what a lot of organizations is really looking for is, yes, we want your loyalty, but we also want your advocacy to go out and say, I had a great experience with this company, and shout that out in their social media to all their friends and family. So there's that intersection, and where I think loyalty in the past has been very kind of transactional. You buy a night in our hotel and we will give you some points, or you get on this flight and we'll give you some points. But there's other elements of the loyalty and advocacy that can be brought into a program like that. And it goes beyond loyalty. It becomes something different in that relationship between the company and the individual.
It makes a lot of sense. It's almost like, it's like any friendship, right?
Yeah.
I would know that we're truly friends if we're going to meet up because we want to enjoy each other's company, as opposed to I'm bribing you with a cup of coffee, right? Yeah. Which is what a lot of loyalty programs end up being. It's just bribing with, hey, get 5 stars and we'll give you this extra thing. You don't really form a connection with them. Yeah. So it's built on the wrong basis, as opposed to what you're saying right now is truly serve them better, give them a better overall relationship, and they will become loyal as a result. It makes a lot of sense. And yourself, Jesper, what kind of marketing trends are you seeing impacting the environment in the next year or two?
Well, I think obviously, a lot of these technologies are becoming more and more accessible. There's the whole idea of everything becoming more composable, which is again a step towards companies being able to transition and pivot faster to new trends in the market. I think that's very important, and that's very tightly connected into cloud. Cloud is an enabler that allows you to get those products to customers faster, which then again ties into we were talking about before with privacy regulations and usage of clouds in different regions, which from a legislation point of view, I think what we're seeing in a lot of markets around the world is that legislation and has to catch up to how quickly markets are actually transitioning. So I think the speed of which we need to be able to adopt these are driving a lot of additional things from a legal point of view as well.
Yeah. And there's a lot of complexity perhaps in this region as well. There's different approaches. I mean, what are your thoughts around that, around data residency? And
yeah, I think, you look at, you have certain markets which are quite homogeneous, and then you have others which are a bit more fragmented in terms of the regulations that are available. So it's something that, we as a technology vendor have to be aware of. And be able to communicate to the customers. But ultimately, I think it is moving very fast, and I think Alex mentioned earlier that it's becoming less of an issue today. There are ways from a technology point of view that we can still deliver these products to the customers.
It's becoming a lot easier, a lot more accessible.
Yeah,
makes a lot of sense. Well, guys, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to the two of you. Optimizely is doing a lot of exciting things. You've just launched in Singapore and now here in Dubai. What's the idea at the moment? I see a lot of expansion. What's behind that drive?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's everything that we covered today, which is, ultimately marketing evolves very, very fast. Marketeers need to evolve. Companies going digital first. Everything has accelerated since the pandemic hit relative to digital first. We've seen this in our business and just the demand from customers, from partners, that really led us to say, like, look, we want to be in Dubai. We want to be in the UAE and the Middle East with our presence. We see the demand around the world. And I think it's also a sign of maturing. It's a sign of, there was kind of like the first wave of digital technologies. Optimized is the next wave of digital technologies to help companies really optimize what they have today. And you should do this continuously. You should bring science to marketing and really have your own growth formula in terms of your business so that you don't just survive today, but you really thrive in today's market. Absolutely. And that's the opportunity ahead. So that's the big idea. I think we're going to be here 5 years from now, hopefully again, and we're going to talk about a business and value that we've created here in the Emirates and in the Middle East that we're hopefully going to be very proud of.
Definitely. It's an exciting time, I think, for your company. It feels like it's an exciting time for the region as well, Jesper. I mean, you and I are both based here in the Middle East. How are you seeing this region in comparison to the rest of the world?
Yeah, I think, I got to do Dubai about 6 years ago. And obviously, as I just mentioned to you, that there was kind of a first wave of digital experience. And I think that was a wave where a lot of people thought that they could kind of leapfrog and transform very quickly into where they wanted to get in terms of the customer experience. I think over the years, people have realized that it's not as easy as such, and they know that it requires these incremental changes to be implemented. It requires a lot more scientific approach and looking at the data and putting that data into good use. So I think that maturity has happened over the last 5-6 years in this region. At least I've witnessed with a lot of customers that realization and that transformation to become slightly more realistic in terms of what they can expect. So I think us coming into the region now is really perfect timing, because there is a need from the customers for technology that allows them to become more scientific and incremental in the way they approach their transformation.
Definitely, that makes a lot of sense. And I think what I've always enjoyed about being here in the Middle East, and this goes for Dubai and Saudi, I would say, is that we spoke earlier about mindset. I feel like the general mindset around the city and these environments is very forward-thinking and very embracing of digital innovation. So I think an approach like yours and what you're suggesting right now, I'm pretty sure it's going to be embraced really well, and I'm excited to see how it pans out. So really nice talking to both of you. You have an event coming up today, so good luck with that, and look forward to future conversations.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great to have you. Thank you.